Before Christopher Columbus got a statue, before Amerigo Vespucci got a continent named after him, before the history books decided who discovered what, a black man from Morocco was already walking through lands no European had ever seen. His name was Estevanico. Some people call him Esteban, some call him Little Stephen. But his real name, the one his mother gave him in North Africa, is lost. And that right there tells you everything about how this story was told, or not told, for 500 years. Estevanico was born sometime around 1500 in Was Moor, a small city on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Was Moor sat on the Rabia River. It was a trading town, a port town, a place where Arabic, Berber, and Portuguese all mixed in the air. He grew up there. He spoke languages the way some people breathe, easily, naturally. He was likely a free man when he was young. That part of his life we don't know in full detail. What we do know is that by the time he was a young adult, he was enslaved by a Spanish nobleman named Andrés Dorantes de Carranza. How that happened, war, capture, trade, nobody wrote it down in a way that survived. What survived was what came after. In 1527, the Spanish crown put together an expedition. The goal was Florida. The man in charge was Panfilo de Narváez, a soldier with one eye and a reputation for cruelty. The fleet had 5 ships and about 600 men. Estevanico was on one of those ships, not as a free man, not as a soldier, but as the enslaved property of Dorantes. Nobody asked him if he wanted to go. Nobody wrote down what he thought that morning when the ships left Spain and pointed toward the unknown. The Narváez expedition was a disaster from the very beginning. They hit Cuba first, and a hurricane there killed 2 ships and 60 men before they even reached Florida. When they finally landed on the Florida coast near present-day Tampa Bay, Narváez made a decision so bad it still reads like fiction. He split the expedition. He sent the ships north along the coast while he led around 300 men on foot through the Florida interior. The idea was to meet up later. They never did. The ships waited, they searched. Eventually, they gave up and sailed away, and those 300 men on foot were completely alone in a land that did not want them there. The Appalachee people fought them. The terrain fought them. The heat, the swamps, the sickness, everything fought them. Narváez kept pushing north and west, and men kept dying. By the time they reached the Gulf Coast near present-day Tallahassee, they had no food, no horses left to eat, and no way back. Narváez decided to build rafts. 5 rafts made from horsehide and pine wood, stitched together with the hair of the horses they had already eaten. About 245 men crammed onto those rafts and pushed out into the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico in late 1528 is not kind to anyone, least of all desperate men on horsehide rafts. Storms hit them. Men fell off and drowned. The currents pulled them apart. By November, most of the rafts had capsized or been destroyed on the Texas coastline. Narváez himself was swept out to sea and never seen again. The men who survived washed up on the Texas coast near what is now Galveston Island. They called it Malhado, the island of misfortune. Of the nearly 600 men who had left Spain, fewer than 100 was still alive, and then that number kept falling, through starvation, through cold, through illness that tore through them like fire through dry grass. By the spring of 1529, there were only 4 survivors who had managed to stay together. 4 men out of 600. One of those 4 was Estevanico. The other 3 were Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, Andrés Dorantes, and Alonso del Castillo Maldonado. 3 Spanish noblemen and 1 enslaved Moroccan man. 4 people stranded in the territory of the Karankawa people on the Texas coast, with no weapons, no armor, no ships, and no way home. What happened next, over the following 8 years, is one of the strangest survival stories in the history of the Americas. They lived with the Karankawa. They had no choice. They learned the language. They ate what the Karankawa ate: roots, shellfish, whatever the land offered. They were treated as servants at first, sometimes as slaves in their own right. Cabeza de Vaca writes in his account, and his account is one of the few documents we have about this period, that they suffered greatly those first winters. People around them were dying of disease and hunger. The Karankawa themselves were suffering. And then something shifted. Cabeza de Vaca writes that they began to heal people. He doesn't explain it in scientific terms because science in 1529 isn't what it is now. But what seems to have happened is this. The 4 survivors, including Estevanico, developed a reputation among the coastal peoples as healers. They prayed over sick people. They used whatever knowledge they had. Whether it was prayer or knowledge of plants or simply the placebo effect of confident strangers, it worked often enough that word spread. People brought the sick to them. The sick sometimes recovered. The reputation grew. Estevanico was not just along for the ride, he was central to this. Cabeza de Vaca's account makes it clear that Estevanico was the primary communicator. He had a talent for languages that the Spanish men didn't have. Wherever they went, Estevanico would learn the local tongue faster, negotiate better, build trust faster. He carried a medicine rattle, a gourd decorated in the style of the native healers, and he understood, probably better than the Spanish men did, how to read a room, how to move through a culture that wasn't his own without making enemies. He had been doing that his whole life. For 8 years they walked. They moved from one group to another, from the Texas coast inland through what is now New Mexico, Arizona, and northern Mexico. They were the first non-native people to see these places, the first to see the American Southwest, the first to hear stories from the peoples there about the lands further north and further west. Everywhere they went, crowds gathered. Hundreds of people sometimes followed them from village to village, curious, reverent, hoping to be healed. Estevanico walked through it all. By 1536, the 4 men had reached the Spanish colonial settlements in northwestern Mexico. They had walked roughly 3,000 miles, and when they finally met Spanish soldiers again, it was jarring in a way that Cabeza de Vaca writes about honestly. The Spanish soldiers wanted to enslave the native people who had helped the survivors reach safety. The survivors, having lived among these people for years, having eaten with them and slept in their homes and been kept alive by their kindness, were horrified. The encounter captures something real about what Estevanico's whole journey exposes: the difference between people who see other humans and people who see resources. The 4 men eventually made it to Mexico City, then called Tenochtitlan. The viceroy, Antonio de Mendoza, was fascinated by their story. They told him about the lands they had crossed, the peoples they had met, and the stories they had heard. Stories about cities to the north, cities of enormous wealth and size. The native peoples of the Southwest had told them things. Whether those stories were literal descriptions of real places, or whether they were legends, or whether the survivors heard what they wanted to hear, nobody knew for certain. But the stories were specific enough to be compelling. The stories were about 7 cities, cities of gold. The Spanish had a legend about this too, the 7 cities of Cibola. It was a myth that had been floating around European imagination for a long time. And suddenly, here were 4 men who had been to the edges of that territory, saying that yes, the people there spoke of great wealthy cities to the north. The viceroy decided to send a scouting expedition. Estevanico was chosen to lead it. Not Cabeza de Vaca, not Dorantes, not Castillo.
the enslaved black Moroccan man who had held the group together for 8 years, who spoke more languages than anyone, who understood how to move through indigenous territories without getting killed. He was the one they sent ahead. Officially, the expedition was led by a Franciscan friar named Marcos de Niza. But everyone who has studied this period honestly agrees that Estevanico was the real guide, the real leader on the ground. Marcos de Niza stayed back. Estevanico went forward. In early 1539, Estevanico set out from the Spanish settlement in Culiacan with a small group of native guides and companions. He moved north ahead of Friar Marcos, sending messages back about what he found. The two men had a system. Estevanico would send a messenger back carrying a cross. The bigger the cross, the more important the find.
If he found something significant, the cross would be large. A few days after leaving, a messenger arrived back at Friar Marcos's cap carrying an enormous cross, the biggest cross possible, as big as a man. Estevanico had found something. He pushed north into what is now Arizona and New Mexico. He encountered the Zuni people. He walked into territory no non-native person had ever entered. He was the first person from the outside world to see the pueblos of the American Southwest, the stone cities stacked against the cliffs, the people living in multi-story dwellings, the whole extraordinary civilization that had been there for centuries while Europe was writing history books about itself. He walked into a Zuni settlement, probably the village of Hawiku in what is now New Mexico. And there, in 1539, Estevanico the Moor died. The details are contested. The Zuni account and the Spanish account don't fully agree. What Friar Marcos wrote was that Estevanico was killed by the Zuni people after some kind of conflict, possibly because he had come in carrying the medicine rattle of a different people, possibly because his demands or behavior created tension, possibly because the Zuni recognized him as an advanced scout for a more dangerous force coming behind him. Some historians think the Zuni were right to be suspicious. The Spanish armies that came after Estevanico proved very quickly exactly what they intended to do to the peoples of the Southwest. Whatever happened at Hawiku, it was the end of Estevanico's road. But let's stop here for a second, because this is the part of the story that usually gets handled quickly, like a footnote, like a sad little ending to tack on to a more important Spanish story. And that is not what this is. What Estevanico's death at Hawiku actually represents is something more complicated, more human, and more worth sitting with. Estevanico was, in the language of the time, enslaved property. He didn't choose any of this. He didn't choose to be in Moor, to be enslaved by Durantes, to sail to Florida, to survive the Texas coast, to walk 3,000 miles, to be sent north as a scout for a colonial project. He didn't write his own story. He couldn't. The people who could write didn't think his inner life was worth recording. What Cabeza de Vaca wrote about him is genuine in some ways and completely limited in others. It's the account of a man writing about property that turned out to be remarkable. And yet, Estevanico left a real mark. He was the first person of African origin to enter what is now the United States. He was the first person from outside the Americas to see the American Southwest. He opened the door to what became the Spanish exploration of New Mexico and Arizona, for better and for worse. Without Estevanico's journey, the expeditions of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado in 1540 don't happen the way they happened. The shape of American colonial history literally changes if you remove Estevanico from it. He matters. He is not a footnote. There is something that gets under your skin when you really read the Cabeza de Vaca account, the Relación, written in 1542. Cabeza de Vaca is honest about his own fear and suffering, and he's honest about Estevanico's gifts. He acknowledges that Estevanico could communicate when none of them could.
He acknowledges that Estevanico was trusted by native peoples in ways that the Spanish men were not. He doesn't fully understand why, but you do, reading it from this side of history. Estevanico wasn't seen as a conquistador. He was a black man from North Africa, enslaved by Spain, stranded in Florida. In many ways, his situation wasn't entirely different from the situations of the enslaved and colonized peoples he walked among. He wasn't the face of empire. He was something else, something harder to categorize. And that in-betweenness, that status as a man who belonged to no empire but used by one, might be exactly why he could move through those cultures and survive where the Spanish soldiers couldn't. There is also something worth saying about how smart he was. Not just street smart, though he was absolutely that, but genuinely intelligent in the way that matters when your life depends on reading situations correctly every single day in conditions that killed everyone else. Every decision Estevanico made out there, which village to enter, how to approach a chief, when to heal and when to keep moving, what to promise and what to withhold, those were life and death calls. In Moor today, there are people who know his story. The city has not forgotten him entirely, though the world mostly has. There are small memorials, quiet acknowledgments. In the American Southwest, among Zuni historians and scholars, there is ongoing debate about what really happened at Hawiku, about whether Estevanico was killed or whether some of him survived in other ways, in stories, in the memory of those villages. The Zuni oral tradition has its own account of a black-skinned stranger who arrived from the south, and the details don't match the Spanish version neatly. Maybe they never will. What does it mean to discover something? The word discover is already uncomfortable when you apply it to lands where millions of people were already living. The Zuni didn't need to be discovered. The Karankawa didn't need Estevanico to find them. The peoples of the Southwest had been there for thousands of years before any of these men arrived. So when we talk about Estevanico discovering America, we have to be careful, because we don't mean what Columbus meant when he said he discovered a place full of people. What Estevanico did was become the first person from outside the Americas to cross what would become the United States on foot, the first to enter the Southwest, the first outsider to see what was there. And he did it not as a conqueror, but as a man trying to survive, using his wits and his extraordinary ability to connect with other human beings. There is something different about that, even if the colonial project he served against his will was destructive. He is not Columbus. He didn't claim land for a crown. He didn't plant a flag. He walked, because that was what the situation required, and he used the one thing nobody could take from him, his ability to understand people, to learn from them, to communicate with them across every boundary of culture and language that should have made it impossible. His story is buried not because it isn't remarkable, it's buried because of who he was, a black man, an enslaved man, a man from Morocco who ended up in the American Southwest by a chain of circumstances that started with someone else deciding to own him. History has always been stingy with names like his. But the ground he walked on is real. The miles are real. The 8 years of survival are real. The influence on the course of American exploration is real and documented. Friar Marcos de Niza used Estevanico's reports to describe what he claimed to have seen, and historians have argued for centuries that Marcos probably never got close to the Zuni pueblos himself, that most of what he reported to the Spanish viceroy was Estevanico's information, Estevanico's eyes, Estevanico's journey, repackaged under a Spanish friar's name. That is what happened to this man's legacy. Over and over again. His work was used, his knowledge was taken, his name was reduced to a detail in someone else's account, and then the someone else got the credit. The name Estevanico itself is a Spanish diminutive, Estevan, with an eco on the end, the kind of suffix you put on something small or someone you don't take seriously. Little Estevan. That's what they called a man who walked 3,000 miles through the most inhospitable terrain in North America and opened up an entire region for the people who were eventually going to name it.